All right, so we are in, I can't remember if this is, I think this is week 6 of our apologetics class, I think. But we're going to be moving into talking about evolution specifically and what we can learn about evolution, how we can better understand evolution, making sure we understand the basic premises of evolution, but then also understand the limitations of evolution, and then a lot of the evidence that has been used really is false evidence, or it's evidence that is misrepresented in the way that it is shared. Even Sandlin was saying a few minutes ago that she recognizes a lot of what we just studied from her Biology 102 class, because a lot of the things that I showed you, the pictures, the experiments, those types of things, they are still the same pictures and experiments that you have in modern day textbooks. So this isn't out of date information. It is information that has been used to teach something that honestly should be out of date, but they just continue perpetuating it as if it's fact, when in fact it is not at all fact. So evolution as a whole is premised on 3 main ideas, and I'm using the term evolution in a generic sense here, because there is provable evolution, which is small scale evolution. It's the type of evolution that is easy to understand and see and watch happen. And then there is large scale evolution, also called macroevolution, also what we would call the theory of evolution. That is not provable. It is just based off of the observation of small scale evolution. But it's based off of the 3 main ideas that are important to understand before we move forward. And I just want to make sure we understand these. One is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And again, as I said in the video, that there's a lot of provable aspects to this observation. We do tend to hand down characteristics that seem to be part of what we have. We hand them down to our children. So if me and my wife both have dark hair, it is very likely that our children will have dark hair. If me and my wife both have blue eyes, the odds are our children are going to have blue eyes. Now, genetics are not that simple, but that is generally the way this goes. If you've got a particular disease, that disease, if it is a genetic disease, can be passed down. And so you'll have your children suffering with some of the same ailments that the parents have. Now, the problem with this is that back when this was first really popularized, that was taken way too far. And it was taken to the extreme of, if I, for whatever reason, in an accident chopped off my left hand, my child would be born with a weak left hand. Or if I were to contract scurvy because of a lack of vitamin C, my child would be born with some of the same characteristics that I had because of my disease. Some diseases work that way, some diseases don't. And so what they would do is they would basically just make that observation that those things pass on. The next premise of evolution is adaptation. Adaptation is the idea that we change to suit the environment, and we do. You go out and work in the garden every day without a shirt on, men, you start to change the way that you look. You might, you're obviously going to change colors because of the sunshine, but you might also even lose a little bit of weight. You might be able to trim some of the fat off. You might be able to sculpt up some muscles because of the hard work you're doing. We tend to change. We even tend to change based on the environment, meaning if you live in a place where, like Seattle, where it is rainy every single day, seemingly, and it is, you're not out in the sunshine very much, you're going to look very different with the lack of sunshine than somebody who lives in sunny Florida. That adaptation changes. There's also a sense in which adaptation happens because of choice, meaning, if you've got birds, which is what Darwin observed, you've got birds, they're going to go where the food supply is most available to them and where they have the least amount of competition. And so you take what Darwin observed is a bird with a large, thick beak that is short is going to be eating the kind like nuts and things like that off of trees. Well, a bird with a long, skinny beak is not interested in nuts because they're not easy for it to eat. And so they're going to go somewhere else where their food is more suited for their type of beak. And so that's just the idea of animals going where the food supply is best and the competition is least. Then there's natural selection, which is if you've got a stubborn bird who's hanging out where he's not able to get food very well, he's going to die out early. He's not going to have as many children. And over the course of generations, the birds in that area are all going to look similar, and the birds that aren't adapted to that area are going to die out. And that's the idea of survival of the fittest or natural selection. Now, all of those are observable truths in nature, okay? The problem with those is that, as is with any truth, if you take it too far, you create something that is false. And that's what tends to happen with evolution, the theory of evolution, with Darwinianism, is it basically was a theory that said, what happens if this has been going on for millions of years? You know, with this, if we kind of count this backwards, explain some of the things we've observed about our world. And of course, on a theoretical basis, it can. That's if you take some leaps of logic and some leaps of faith, you can make it say some things that it's not actually true. Any questions or thoughts on that before I move on? Yes, no hands. All right, well, then we go back to the slide here. All right, I'm trying not to repeat myself too much, but it's kind of necessary right here in the very beginning. Microevolution, these three things happening on a small scale are absolutely true. Macroevolution, or large-scale evolution, is only a theory. And it is only a theory because we cannot prove it, because it is not something that we can observe. It is not something that we can experiment. All we can do is say the part that we know is true, if we multiply it times 1,000,000 and give us millions of years, well, how big a change could happen over the millions of years if we saw this small changeover happen over the course of a dozen years? And so it is a logical leap of what would happen if this happened, if we had enough time. The other side of this that scientists really struggle with is that it also requires for us to really know anything, consistency over time. Meaning things must have changed at a consistent rate over time in order for us to count backwards, okay? That's one of the difficulties you run into, and we're going to talk about that some in our next week's lesson as we talk about is there proof that the Earth is young versus the Earth being millions of years old. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that now, but again, this is where it becomes very hard to really prove anything when it comes to the theory of evolution. One of the things they've tried to use to try to prove the theory of evolution is the fossil records. Well, the fossil records really only work if there has been a consistent, regular rate of decay in that fossil for the course of millions of years. Now, the things that can interfere with that would be a worldwide catastrophe. Have any worldwide catastrophes happened in the past million years? We as believers would say absolutely, there's the flood. Scientists agree that they have too. I mean, have any of you ever heard of the Ice Age? Scientists believe in an ice age. That would have been a worldwide catastrophe. That would have dramatically affected the idea or the ability to look at the fossil records and prove anything. Not only has there been worldwide catastrophes, but there's been localized catastrophes. And not only have there been localized catastrophes, but there's been other aspects or things that have happened that have created an impossible situation for going and really counting back time. I skipped over a lot of the quotes that I put in the video about evolution, about the fossil record, but I did want to at least point out this. Darwin wrote when he was talking about evolution, when we descend to details, we cannot prove that a single species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory. I bring that up because I think sometimes we have let the name Charles Darwin become a byword. We've let it become, he was so evil. He just tried to pull the whole world away from God. And that is not at all what Charles Darwin was doing. Charles Darwin was a naturalist. He originally was a believer, but he kind of walked away from that. And he was a naturalist, and he was looking for a theory that would explain what faith had always explained to him. He had always believed in there being a God, and when he walked away from that, he needed answers. And so he is the one who took this idea and more or less popularized it. He didn't come up with it. But even when he came up, or when he popularized it, when he wrote about it in The Origin of the Species, he was extremely honest with the fact of his theory had holes. His theory had a lot of problems. And that one of the big problems was the fossil records didn't support it. Now, luckily on his side, he had the argument of ignorance, meaning we just didn't have a lot of fossils to go off of yet. And therefore he theorized that eventually the more fossils we found, the more proof there would be that his theory was correct. Unfortunately for him, the more fossils we found, the more we've realized how his theory really isn't supported at all by the fossil records. And so that becomes very difficult for him to really hold on to that theory when that's what he's dealing with. But he himself was a very honest man regarding his theory, regarding what he thought, regarding the actual scientific nature of whether what he said was true or not. I've mentioned Michael Behe before in this class, and I encourage anybody who hasn't read this book to pick it up. It's probably in the library. It's in my office there at the building if you ever want to borrow it from me. But it is a book called Darwin's Black Box, and it's the idea that there's a lot that Darwin couldn't have known. There's a lot that Darwin, because of when he lived and the technology that existed at the time, he had to make a lot of assumptions in order to prove his theory. And Michael Behe is a proponent that if Darwin would have lived today with the information and the technology that we have today, he himself would reject his own theory. Because he is not an intellectually dishonest man, at least at the writing of The Origin of the Species. He was somebody who was concerned about finding answers and coming up with what are possible answers. Some of the black box issues, the things that Darwin couldn't see, it would be things like I mentioned in the next several slides, which is proteins versus DNA. Darwin would not have known anything about proteins or DNA. He might have known about proteins, but he definitely did not know about DNA, nor know a lot of what protein does. One of the main jobs of protein is seen on this screen: transcription and translation of DNA. DNA is the code of amino acids which gathered together makes protein. And that's essentially what proteins do. They work the DNA, they carry things to and from the cells, they do the job of opening up or unzipping the DNA and transcribing it and creating duplicates of it, or at least mirror images of it. It creates RNA, all of the things that we're hearing about in the news right now because COVID-19 is an RNA virus and all that kind of stuff. So proteins do that job. Well, all of us are aware of how complicated DNA is, right? We've all heard that for a couple of decades, ever since they started trying to map the DNA sequence of the human body. Well, proteins are equally complex. For Darwin, all he could see was a square when you're dealing with plant cells. I don't even think he could see the outline of an animal cell. He could only see the outline of a plant cell, and all he saw was the outline of it. He didn't have a clue how complicated it was, all the different parts of a cell that we have to diagram today in our biology and microbiology classes. And he didn't have a clue what was inside the nucleus of a cell and the complexity of the DNA sequence and how long it would be and all of those types of things. Darwin, part of his theory is that as things get smaller, they have to get simpler. It's the only way his theory works. Well, what have we found since Darwin's death? As we've gotten high-powered microscopes and been able to look at things smaller and smaller and smaller, are things getting simpler? Not at all. And so his theory kind of gets washed away by that information he didn't have. The cilium and the flagellum, which is the little tail that works on some one-celled organism. Now, one-celled organisms, again, he would have had a little bit of an understanding of that, but not like we do today, where we can actually see the structure of the flagellum and how it works. And we look at that and go, it is extremely complex. And what's amazing about it is there's not a single part of the flagellum mechanism that is in those cells that if it were missing, the flagellum would still work. It's too complicated, and every part of it is needed in order to make it work. Same thing with the eyeball. Any of y'all wearing glasses right now realize how true this is, right? I mean, we know that the eyeball can so easily go wonky, and that's because the eyeball, every single piece is necessary, and if you don't have the pieces there, it doesn't work. Blood clotting the same way, and we won't dig into all of that again since we dug into it in the video. Now, what you have in our bodies is this. There are so many parts of our body that if one piece goes wrong, so many parts of nature that if one part of it were missing, the whole thing shuts down. All of it. It would be like taking a watch and taking out just one of the gears. Is it still going to work? Not at all. It's irreducibly complex. It is an irreducibly complex system. And because of that, we've got a problem when it comes to evolution. This is why Darwin said things had to get simpler the smaller they get, because the smaller it is, it becomes just a piece of the more complicated system. But as we go smaller and we realize everything stays complicated, what we find out is there's no way to simplify it. You have to have it in its entirety in order for the system to work. And if the system doesn't work, well, then how can we argue that it changed, it added complexity a little bit by little bit by little bit to get to where it is today, when if we reduced it at all, it had no point? Why would that, why would something exist with no point for millions of years, only so that it could exist today and be complex and functioning? You see what I'm saying? All right, Larry, go.
Yeah, that's where you get into arguments about, well, if you have enough time, maybe all these things would come together. But there's not enough time. No matter how much time you give them, the statistics don't play that way.
Yeah, absolutely right. And the other side of that is this. Evolution, because of its main premise, is that everything is done for the benefit of the, it is survival of the fittest. There is no system that would exist for millions of years as an unfunctioning system, because that would have absolutely no benefit. That would not be a survival of the fittest. And so that idea of, the way evolutionists have to argue is that it worked at every single level. It just got more complicated as you went along. The problem is we can't figure out on a lot of these systems how it could have existed as a simpler mechanism in order to serve a purpose before it got more complicated. And so it becomes what is the key phrase there is irreducibly complex, which again makes it very difficult to really argue that. So if you're not arguing, went away from the right screen. If you're not arguing systems, and that systems came to be from a kind of a slow process, what, you're not arguing from a fossil record standpoint. How do you prove evolution? And so what they have to do is find what's called the transitional forms. But I think you probably noticed, and I'm going to breeze through them real fast tonight, because if you want to hear more about them, you can either research them or go back and watch the video. But look how many, have any of y'all ever heard of the Nebraska man? Okay, it's still in textbooks today. But it was proven to be a hoax put out by Henry Osborn back in the 20s, and it was revealed to be a tooth of a pig. The Piltdown man was another fossil that they found that they thought was transitional, but they found out that it was actually the mandible, the jaw of an orangutan with a modern human skull, and it was not at all what it was being presented to be. Lucy was a primitive a skeleton that they put together as a kind of a hunched over monkey-like human female. That is a primitive female. And again, she had all of the indications that she was a ape-like woman, except for that she was an ape and not a woman. And that's the problem, that I do want to read this quote again, just because I love that Donald Johannesson, who was the one who found Lucy, which was the most significant evolutionary find of its time. There is no such thing as a total lack of bias. I have it. Everybody has it. The fossil hunter in the field has it. And everybody who is looking for hominids, there's a strong urge to learn about more of where the human line started. If you're working back at around 3 million, as I was, that is very seductive, because you begin to get an idea that that is where Homo did start. You begin straining your eyes to find Homo traits in fossils of that age. Logical maybe, but also biased. I was trying to jam evidence of dates into a pattern that would support conclusions about fossils which, upon closer inspection, the fossils themselves would not sustain. And I say all that to go back to the concept we've talked about repeatedly since the beginning of this class. This is not a battle of evidence. It is a battle of worldviews. This absolutely has nothing to do with who has the evidence on their side, because they do not have the evidence for evolution or for their millions of year process of the theory of evolution. All they have is a worldview and a desire to find it. And so they see it in places where it doesn't exist, and they see it in ways that it's just not there. And that's one reason I like this picture that I put here that I took from the Creation Museum. If you look real carefully, I think you can see that's Tant or Khan right there on the screen in the reflection. But I mean, if all you've got is that tiny little head, that skull right there, these are your, some of your many possibilities of what that skull could look like. And who's going to make that choice? If I'm making that choice and I want to prove that this is an ape man, a transitional form between man and monkey, well, then I'm going to make it look like a man monkey, right? Just the other day, Gibson was watching a program. I think it was just Gibson was watching a program, and it was talking about a recent paleontological find of a dinosaur. And it said that this dinosaur very likely had feathers. And I asked Gibson, I said, how do they know that it has feathers? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, they can't. And I said, how would they know if it had feathers or not? Based on the bones that they found. He said, they can't. Well, what would they have to find to know whether it has feathers or not? The skin or the feathers. It's interesting. They have found dinosaurs with skin. There's actually a dinosaur, I think in Australia, they actually, instead of calling it a fossil, they call it a mummified dinosaur, because it still has muscle and dried out muscle and skin attached to it. Do you know what's not there? Feathers. No feathers, because they were reptiles. I mean, it's one of those things of you just don't have it. They're not there at all. Donald Johanson went on to say, "It's hard for me now to admit how tangled in that thicket I was, but the insidious thing about bias is that it does make one deaf to the cries of other evidence." The truth is, because this is a worldview discussion and it is not an evidence discussion, this is an issue of people will see what they want to see and they will be deaf to other possibilities. And so you have to, unfortunately, do the hard job of dissuading them from what they want to believe before you can persuade them of what they should believe. And that becomes a very, sometimes, difficult process. Neanderthal man is explained very easily by men and women who had rickets and arthritis and other bone diseases. We see the same changes in our modern skulls today when somebody has an advanced form of certain diseases. You've got Java man, who was found by Eugene Dubois, and it, again, the femur was found 15 meters upstream, a tooth, a skull cap, and they realized later on that all these bones that were scattered out in all sorts of different places belonged to different creatures. Imagine that. They weren't found together, they were found scattered out. So again, I don't know why we have a hard time understanding they came from different places. Rhodesian man was the bones of a man, a woman, and two women. It was later found out to just be a man that was put together poorly by somebody who didn't specialize in human skeletons. He specialized in bird skeletons. So of course he's going to see joints differently than the way somebody, an anthropologist studying humans would. Arctopithecus Romitas cadaver, bones found over 5 different locations over the course of 5 different years, miles apart from each other, yet they were claimed to be all from one person or one group of people. And they were proclaimed to be the link based on a toe bone found 10 miles away from the other bones. And again, I say all that not to stir up trouble, not to cause anybody to think that, I'm not calling names or throwing people under the bus, but I want people to realize there is a lot of bias in this discussion when you deal with the evidence. Not yet have they found a transitional man, not yet have they found transitional forms between animals. The fossil record 100% doesn't support evolution. Yet, how many of us were taught that it does? I mean, I would imagine every single one of us was taught that in our high schools and in our colleges. And so that becomes important for us to recognize. We have to be critical with the evidence in order to make sure that we're being honest with ourselves about the evidence. I want to come back and talk about races at the end, but just kind of speed things along here. Again, all of these charts that I'm showing here, and I'm not going to spend any time on them because I want us to have more discussion. All of these charts, none of them prove evolution. Every single one of them runs the possibility of being a hoax. And even if it's a true thing, like this one here, Darwin Benches is a true observation of nature, it doesn't actually prove evolution, at least macroevolution. It proves microevolution. They're all still finches. The tree of life, where he tried to put that together, still no evidence for that. No evidence that just because there's commonality in bone structure, that this means that you have a common ancestor. That is an assumption. The fact that we bred 4-winged fruit flies that can't fly doesn't prove anything. The peppered moth hoax that was perpetuated during the Industrial Revolution. The Miller-Urey experiment, which actually didn't produce life. It produced a trace of amino acids, but it was done by intelligence, and predominantly what was done by intelligence in an untrue, impossible atmospheric condition. And really, mostly what they produced was waste, not a beautiful display of life that all works together. Vestigial structures, some people have tried to say, well, if there was a creator, then there wouldn't be any wasted parts in the human body. Well, we're finding out there's not. There's the link between reptile and birds that now they're admitting is just a well-developed bird from back when in the early days. The ape to human chart, which again proves nothing. And ultimately what you come back to is evolution is not based off of evidence. Evolution is based off of worldview. Now, they will grab evidence to prove what they want it to say. They will even manipulate some of them, not all of them. I would say most scientists are very honest. But some of them will even manipulate the data in order to try to make it match the theory. But the truth is, evolution is believed in because people want to believe in it. Not because the evidence is conclusive, and not because there's any sort of experiment that's ever been done to prove it, not because the fossil records match it, not because the smaller things are, the simpler they get until they become more complicated. There's not a single premise of the theory of evolution or macroevolution that holds weight. Not a single one. And so you tell me why in the world somebody would believe it unless it's just what they want to believe. It is literally the only option that really is popular if you want to not believe in faith and God and religion. If you're forcing yourself to believe all things have a natural beginning, then you have to come up with a theory, and this is the best that exists. No evidence for it, though. And you're finding that there is a larger segment of the scientific community that is now rejecting Darwinianism. They're not necessarily rejecting evolution, but they're rejecting Darwinianism, the theory of evolution, because there's just no evidence for it. And if you're being honest, that's your only option. Any thoughts, questions, additions on any of that? Questions of something you want to explain better? Go ahead, Alan.
Just if this is where we all were supposed to have come from, where all of humanity, and even from species to species, these transitional creatures should be everywhere. There should be thousands and thousands of examples of it, and they can't find one.
Yeah. Well, and again, that has created other theories to pop up as to why. For instance, there's one that was, I don't think many believe in it now, but there was one that was up for a while called punctuated equilibrialism. I think that's the name of it. But it was basically the idea that evolution happened in stages, and the time between stages happened really fast. The problem with that is there's not a single bit of evidence that that's the way it would happen, and the only reason to believe that is to try to explain away the lack of fossil records. So that's the only reason that theory was ever even fabricated, was to try to explain away why the evidence isn't there. Not because the evidence actually caused them to believe that. But yeah, I mean, you're right. You would expect if it took thousands of years for something to develop from one form to another, you should have thousands of years of evidence of that. You should have those transitional forms. And it makes no sense why we have all of these stationary developed forms of animals, but we don't have any of the transitions between them. So yeah. Any other, who else? Larry, go ahead.
There should also be evidence of continuing change too. If that's, we shouldn't have hit the end of the line at some point and not progress further.
Oh, come on, we're the best. I mean, we're top of the line. This is we're high quality. Now, I mean, you're absolutely right. But again, the problem with that is we can't see macroevolution because it takes so long. So they would argue, well, we are still evolving. we don't know what we will be, but 10 million years from now, they will see that we were still evolving. We just can't see it in the current present. That's a convenient answer if you ask me. But who else? Inner thoughts, additions? Nothing? Wow. All right, well then I want to go back to talk about the race aspect that we talked about in the video that I just kind of threw in there. I believe it was Steve that asked that in the very beginning. I could be wrong on my memory though. But the idea that, where did the races come from? The Bible's answer actually doesn't answer race. The Bible answers language, but does not answer race. Because we know that the languages came from Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel story, where God confused their languages and then they separated based on language. Well, what about race? The simple answer is this: race isn't real. From a biblical perspective, we are not multiple species. We are not any different from one another other than we have different physical characteristics. One of the interesting things that I've come across as I've studied apologetics and these types of things is, we like to talk a lot about species. Who made up species? We did. We as humans are the ones who have designated what is a species and what isn't. And I think we've done that decently well based on certain biological principles as far as, what animals breed with what animals and those types of things. Well, go ahead, Alan.
Well, God did, call things by kind. I mean, it's different.
Different than species.
Okay.
Okay, I had a feeling you were going to go there. So kind is different than species. Kind is in some ways what we mean by species, but what I'm talking about is we are the ones who have created what we call taxonomy, the idea of family, phylus, genus, species, all of those different levels of separation where we've tried to group things together, like things together, and then split them where they get different. And so instead of just saying fish and land creatures and bird creatures, or air creatures, we would say, based on the way animals behave, based on which animals breed with which animals, we have certain species. Well, I say that because if you go back and look at that chart, and let me see if I can get back to it here. The chart of what Darwin observed there in, I went the wrong way on my presentation here. Let me get to it. What Darwin observed there in, at the Galapagos Islands. He was observing all of these birds, right? And so we got vegetarian finch, small ground finch, medium ground finch, large ground finch, large cactus finch, sharp-beaked ground finch. Those are the only ones I can see because of y'all's beautiful faces over there on the side of my screen. So we have all these different species of finches, right? And so we've got a crossing of species depending on how you define species. Well, we're the ones who have created all of these separations. I would argue that for God, a finch is a kind, and all the rest of these things are designations we've given them based on observation and their characteristics. So we can have a crossbreeding of species. Look at dogs and look at cats. We pride ourselves on coming up with new species, right? But are those really species? Are they kinds? All of that is stuff that we have designated and put together in our attempt to try to understand and categorize and put things together in a way that they make sense to us. Race is somewhat similar to that. We are all human. That's just the simple answer that God gives us. We are all human. We are not different species. We are not incredibly different from each other. We just have different physical characteristics. And so within the human species, within our humankind, we can have a lot of different colors of people, but we are essentially all the same. Now, we do have differences in our genetics. We do, based on some of our genetics, we're more susceptible to certain diseases versus other diseases, those types of things. But as a whole, what God created was not light, medium, and dark. What God created was human. And within human, there was the capacity for a beautiful variety of color among humans. And you've got dark skin, medium skin, light skin, more yellowish skin, more orangish skin, more reddish skin. I mean, you've got a lot of variation in skin color based on melatonin and those types of things. And so, and on a genetic basis, we are all pretty much potentially the same. One of the problems with evolution is that evolution has presented a fairly racist view of the way we should view humankind. Because if you ever look at all of the pictures, whenever they draw an ancient transitional form, he is never Caucasian. He's always dark-skinned or medium-skinned. And one of the reasons for that is because Darwinism assumes that because there is a, even from a genetic basis, that the more evolved person is lighter skinned. And I don't know that that is in any way something we could or should stand behind. We are all beautiful creatures that God has designed, and we are all souls that need God. God demands equality between races. And honestly, even in scripture, when it talks about races, it talks about races from a cultural standpoint, not from a color standpoint. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but no, when you get to the New Testament, like Genesis or Galatians chapter 3, verse 28 there, and it talked about there is neither, anybody remember what it says? Jew nor Greek. Whenever the Bible talks about races, it talks about it from a cultural standpoint, not from a color standpoint. And so the whole color idea is not a scriptural idea. I remember back a couple of years ago, the first time I heard somebody say that they were taught that black-skinned people were black-skinned because God made black-skinned people. Does anybody know where God made them? I wonder if any of y'all have heard this. All right, Fultz family, where?
Probably when Cain was marked. Cain?
Yeah, the mark of Cain. That when Cain was cursed, that was part of the curse that was given to Cain, that he was given the mark, that God changed the way his body looked, and that's what allowed him to survive. Now, here's what I find hilarious about that, because that's normally said in a somewhat derogatory manner, that black people are cursed because they carry the curse of Cain, just like everybody else carries the curse of Adam. But here's what I find interesting about that. Why did God give Cain the curse, or give Cain the mark, not the curse? He gave him the curse because of his sin. Why did God give him the mark?
To protect him.
To protect him. He gave him the mark as a blessing, not as a curse. And so if you look there in Genesis chapter 4, he says, my punishment is too great, in verse 13. Since you are banishing me today from the face of the earth, I must hide from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord replied to him, in that case, Whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And he placed a mark on Cain so that whoever found him would not kill him. And so it was actually an act of love, not an act of punishment. It was an act of blessing. He was protecting him. So again, I find it hilarious that oftentimes that assumption is made in a somewhat derogatory manner, but the truth is what Cain, what God was doing was actually giving him a blessing, giving him a protection. And so the Bible really doesn't ever, as far as I'm aware, ever address the color of skin. It addresses the worth of humankind. It addresses our different cultures, but it does not address color. It absolutely floors me that in the past, churches that I have taught at have had an issue with color, had an issue with people, Black or Mexican or whatever it is coming in and acting like having different people is going to be a problem, different kinds of people is going to be a problem. And I look at that and go, what a blessing that is. I also hate that we avoid talking about it. And again, racism works a lot of ways. The way that I hear racist comments most often is when we say something like we're talking about somebody and then we go, oh, and he's Black. And we whisper it and I know why we do that, because we don't want anybody to think we're racist. But the fact that we feel like we have to whisper it actually says something about the way we view race. The color that we are is not a shameful thing. If I go out and I get sunburnt tomorrow, I don't expect any of y'all to go, oh, watch out for Adam, he's red. Like why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. We are the color we are because God created a beautiful array of differences within our human race. And so that whole concept of race, we are not races, we are a human race. That's it. And shame on us if we, and I'm kind of shutting down that conversation in a way, and I don't mean to, but we cannot view it any other way if we're going to view this the way God views it. Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question about, so evolutionists who have drawn these pictures of, evolving, and you said the ones that are the most evolved are drawn as a Caucasian. So is that, and when I mean intent, is it intentionally, or is it just they're just picking a color? Would they argue that it was a Caucasian, or are they just drawing a Caucasian, but they would say Caucasian or Black or yellow or, is that part of what they're saying? What I'm
yes
saying?
and no. I don't know that all of them would say it. I do know that that was a predominant thought and idea back 50 years ago, back when evolution was really being developed. I put one quote in here, and there's a lot more quotes about this, but let me get back down to that one. Oh, back up here. This one right here: the Negroid stock is even more ancient than the Caucasian and Mongolian, as may be proved by an examination not only of the brain, of the hair, of the bodily characters. The standard of intelligence of the average Negro is similar to that of an 11-year-old youth of the species Homo sapiens. I mean, that's about as ugly as it gets, in my opinion. And that was not again, that's 1980. So that's not that distant from where we are. And what you find is that was a predominant viewpoint among evolutionists. I suggested a couple of weeks ago, I think, the video Expelled. Have any of y'all seen that movie? It's like a documentary. I encourage every single one of you to watch it. Maybe we'll have a big movie viewing party and watch it together. I can put a projector outside and big speakers, and we can all watch it together in my driveway. But It is an excellent movie, and it is about the idea that if you teach intelligent design, you're going to be expelled from the classroom as a professor. And that's where the video begins. But it moves on. The second half of the whole video is about how the role that the theory of evolution played in World War II and Nazi Germany. And that one of the main concepts of what Hitler was trying to do in Nazi Germany was to create the super race. And he believed that the super race was fair in every way, meaning fair-headed, fair-colored eyes, bluish, the lighter colored eyes, and light skin, because he believed, based on evolution, that the darker your characteristics were, the more ancient your evolution was, and therefore you had not evolved enough. That was where a lot of that concept came from. And obviously that had a major impact on our country. That was one of the reasons he hated Jews. Jews tend to be dark-skinned. And so that was part of the thought process there. So again, it's one of those, I'm not in any way saying that if someone believes in evolution, they are a racist. I am saying that the theory of evolution that they believe in is racist. And therefore, they probably need to reconsider, because a lot of the people who are evolutionists are also oddly social justice warriors, right? I mean, they're all about the community and social justice and extinguish poverty and all of that sort of thing, which again, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you believe in evolution, you should believe in survival of the fittest, not supporting the unfit, which is really what they're doing in social justice ideas. We as Christians have a reason to support the poor. We as Christians have a reason to help the needy, but an evolutionist really doesn't. An evolutionist should take what's theirs because you only live once, and I worked hard, I got to where I'm at, I should enjoy it, right? I mean, that's an evolutionary concept. So it is funny to me how backwards some of their thought processes are if you really follow them through. Who else has a question? Addition? Nobody? That's it? All right, well then we are going to move into next week talking about the proof that the Earth is not millions of years old. Because again, it's all well and good to throw out some of the evidence or a lot of the evidence that the evolutionists will use to try to prove evolution. But we also need to have an answer for our own theory, our own ideas, our own belief system. So is there evidence that the world is actually as young as we believe it is? Is there evidence that the world is actually, instead of millions of years old, thousands of years old? And I believe there's plenty, and we're going to talk about a lot of that next week. And then we're also going to talk about dinosaurs, because if, as the Bible says, we were created in 6 days, then there must be an explanation of dinosaurs, because, again, have you read a book recently that said that man rode on the backs of dinosaurs or anything like that? Obviously not. So we'll talk about that also next week and try to make sure that we have a good basis for understanding why the biblical answer is truly an answer that is based on evidence, not just based on belief. All right? Sound good to everybody? All right, well then we will talk to you later. I'll see y'all later. Bye.